The second civilization or empire that we're going to talk about in this presentation it brings us back to China. And China, of course, as we've already seen, had become well established with the Zhou dynasty. But the Zhou dynasty in the latter years, in the last few hundred years of their rule, began to look a little bit different. And so we need to look at how that begins to change as we enter into this classical era. And one of the big changes is the rise of the Shure elite. It's spelled S-H-I, but it's pronounced Shure, and it's a really important group and concept. Somewhere around the 5th century BCE, professional administrators begin to emerge, and that's the people that we call the Shure elite. What marks them and what is notable about them is that they're particularly well educated. They know how to read, and they write down and codify and study. They know the customs of the Chinese people and what is being done in that society, and they become valued advisors to the rulers of the Zhou dynasty, gaining a certain amount of power, and they will last. The Shure elite and this idea of an educated group of advisors that begin to hold significant governmental power is one that survives not only through the end of the Zhou dynasty, but all the way into the modern era. So we're going to be running across the Shure a lot, and this is really when they begin to make the scene. The other thing that begins to happen during the last centuries of the Zhou dynasty, particularly around, I'd say maybe the 4th century BCE, is changes in the nature of warfare. And that's fairly significant in several ways. Up till now, in the 4th century or so BCE, war was largely waged by the aristocracy, and it's really something that is fought in many cases about honor and control for the aristocracy. But by the time we get into the 300s BCE, we're into the age of the Maurya dynasty in India, who we will talk about, Alexander the Great in Greece, who we will also talk about. Armies are becoming larger, and they're going further afield to wage conquest. And the administration of those armies becomes important. The administration of these larger empires is becoming important, but particularly with military. How do you move an army that size? How do you control it across these kinds of distances? How do you supply them with the things that they need to be effective? Conquest of the social structure begins to change. It's we're no longer just shaming the aristocracy. We're conquering people. And so all of this begins to change, and one of the people who begins to write about this and observe this is a fellow by the name of Sun Tzu. He writes a very famous book called The Art of War, one of the most famous commentaries on military craft of all time. The ideas that Sun Tzu begins to bring to the idea of how you effectively wage war and administer in this new era is one that is carried forward. It gets used by the subsequent dynasties of China, the Qin, the Han, and others, and is still referred to in the modern day. Napoleon made extensive use of the art of war. He studied it and used many of its ideas. And so it's something we should probably talk a little bit about in class as well, but this is kind of what's going on in the group. Another dynasty called the Qin dynasty. And the Qin dynasty is actually the shortest lasting dynasty of the entire history of the Chinese people, but it's a very, very important one. The Qin only rule as a dynasty from about 221 BCE to 210 BCE. We're talking about 11 years, but they do some pretty interesting and important things in that very short period of time that greatly change and transition what China begins to look like. The guy who creates the Qin dynasty is known as Qin Shi Huangdi, and he conquered the various states of China and created really the first true empire in China, not throughout the world, but in the first Chinese empire. And he brought peace, at least for a brief period of time, to the Chinese people. But he's kind of an interesting guy. Qin Shi Huangdi is highly autocratic. He's very, very harsh as a ruler. This is the rise of the legalists. This is when the legalists really dominate in China and run the show. And so the world looks very different in China during this particular dynasty. The feudal states that had existed under the Zhou were abolished. Military districts were established instead in order to rule. And showing that legalist influence, he begins to standardize everything and control everything. And when I say that he standardizes everything, Qin Shi Huangdi creates standard weights and measures. He creates a common currency for the first time. He brings down such detail and standardizes life so much that even the cart axles all had to be a uniform length, for which there's actually a good reason. What he really wanted is that all the wheels would be in the same spot so that the ruts in the road would accommodate the wheels. They'd all fit in the same rut. So it sounds kind of silly, and yet it gives you some idea of the level of detail that he was doing in terms of how he ruled in that legalist impulse. He also is particularly famous because he is the one who began to start the production of what becomes known as the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China was built as a defensive structure, and it is deceptively large. That picture, really, it's hard to fully tell how big it is there. But this was a wall that was built to protect China, particularly from the north and the west, which seemed to be the areas that they had the greatest influence. And actually, if you look closely on that map, you will see some blue lines. That's really where the Great Wall is. And what he built was the largest structure, certainly of his time, and one that to this day is one of the few structures that can be seen from outer space. Of course, technology has changed. We can see a lot of things that we didn't used to be able to see. It is wide enough for troops and carts and so on to travel in both directions on that wall. It is high enough to make it almost impossible for someone to scale it and so on. It really is a very large, impressive structure. But the other thing about Qin Shi Huangdi, and kind of a wonderful story, if nothing else, maybe not the most important, is his efforts to find immortality. And he was so interested in becoming immortal that he began to take medicines. Daily pills of mercury is what he actually took. As you probably know, mercury is toxic, however, and the result of that is that eventually the daily doses of mercury drove him mad and actually ultimately killed him as well. And so when he dies, he builds and had commissioned a really remarkable burial site. He was buried under a mound of dirt in a pyramid-like structure, which is as large as the Great Pyramid of Egypt, but it was open in the center. And so it looks a little bit different. And there's these underground sections. There's an underground burial vault with a ceiling that is studded with precious gems in patterns to form the stars of the night sky. The ground on this burial vault is laid out as a map. It's a map of his empire in China, with the tomb carefully placed in the exact center of that. But the rivers and the lakes are there and so on. Those rivers and lakes flow with liquid mercury, not water. It's really a pretty extraordinary structure, as you can imagine. And surrounding this area is what becomes known as the Terracotta Army. But it's really more than just an army. It's a small city with terracotta dancers and horses and carts and chariots and so on. Terracotta being basically a clay figure. It's made with coils of clay. And what he ended up doing, just the army alone has over 7,500 life-size soldiers, as well as the horses, the chariots, and so on. Each figure entirely different. They're unique. It's not cut from a mold or anything like that. They're each a piece of artistry. And that army of 7,500 soldiers is there to protect protect him. A picture of it in your textbook as well on page 158, but you can see a couple of pictures here of some of the terracotta soldiers that have been unearthed. When this tomb was completed, everybody who was involved in it, everybody who was involved in designing the tomb and so on, was shut in with his body so that none of the secrets of the tomb would be revealed. And so you end up with really kind of an extraordinary piece on all of this. And so he passed on. And when he died, that's really kind of just about the end of the Qin dynasty. By 210 BCE, he had enslaved so many people to both build the Great Wall of China, which of course it wasn't completed while he was alive, and to build this tomb for his burial that crops were failing, there were other shortages, economically China was beginning to fall apart. And there ended up being a struggle for succession as to who would follow him. Actually, his second son killed his older brother and tried to take charge, but he was not able to maintain control, and so the Qin dynasty collapsed, and that's where we end up with really only an 11-year dynasty. But quite a bit of both interesting things with things like the burial tomb, lasting important pieces like the Great Wall there, and that legalist influence, which is never